The gentle patter of rain against the windows of Prestige Motors created a soothing rhythm, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that would soon unfold inside the luxury car dealership. It was just another Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta, or so the staff thought, when Eleanor Washington stepped through the glossy glass doors, her practical rubber-soled shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. At 72, Eleanor carried herself with the quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of breaking barriers and proving people wrong. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and despite the rain, she wore a simple but clean beige raincoat over her everyday clothes. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she could buy the entire dealership without batting an eye. The showroom sparkled under the bright LED lights, with rows of pristine vehicles that gleamed like precious jewels. A sleek black sedan caught Eleanor's eye immediately. Its curves reminded her of the first car her late husband Thomas had ever sold, back when they were just starting out with a single used car lot in 1975. As Eleanor moved through the showroom, she couldn't help but notice how the sales staff seemed to look right through her. Two younger salesmen in crisp suits were huddled near the coffee machine, glancing her way occasionally but making no move to help. A woman in designer heels clicked past her, heading straight for a couple in expensive clothing who had just walked in. Interesting, Eleanor thought to herself, remembering how Thomas had always stressed the importance of treating every customer like they could be your best sale. That philosophy had helped them build Washington Automotive Group from a single lot into one of the largest dealership networks in the Southeast. Not that anyone here knew that. Eleanor had always preferred to stay behind the scenes, letting the business run itself while she focused on their charitable foundation. The couple who had just entered were immediately swarmed by 3 salespeople, all eager to help them explore the luxury SUV section. Eleanor watched as they were offered coffee, guided to comfortable seats, and treated like royalty. Meanwhile, she continued her solitary walk among the cars, running her fingers along the smooth metal, remembering the countless hours she'd spent helping Thomas perfect his sales pitches in their tiny apartment kitchen. After 15 minutes of being completely ignored, Eleanor approached the reception desk. The young man behind it was absorbed in his phone, barely glancing up as she cleared her throat. "Excuse me," Eleanor said politely, "I'm interested in learning more about that black sedan over there." She pointed to the car that had caught her eye earlier. The receptionist looked up reluctantly, his eyes scanning her warm raincoat and sensible shoes. "Ma'am, that's our premium line. The monthly payments alone would be—" He paused, clearly trying to find a polite way to say what he was thinking. "I understand it's expensive," Eleanor said calmly. "I'd still like to know more about it." The floor manager, who had been watching the exchange, walked over. His badge read Robert Chen. He had that artificial smile Eleanor had seen countless times before, the one that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "perhaps I can direct you to Wilson's Used Cars down on Palmer Street, then have some very nice, affordable options that might be more suitable for your budget." Eleanor felt a familiar ache in her chest, not from anger, but from disappointment. In all these years, some things hadn't changed as much as she'd hoped. She thought of Thomas, of all the times they'd been underestimated, all the doors that had been closed in their faces before they built their empire. "Actually," Eleanor replied, her voice steady, "I'm quite interested in this particular vehicle. Would someone be willing to show it to me?" Robert's smile tightened. "Ma'am, this is a very exclusive dealership. We have serious customers waiting. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A young salesman nearby snickered, not even trying to hide his amusement. The couple being helped nearby glanced over, then quickly looked away, embarrassed by the scene. Eleanor stood there for a moment, taking in the showroom she technically owned, looking at the employees who had no idea they worked for her, and thought about Thomas. He had always said that the true measure of a business wasn't in its profits, but in how it treated people. "Very well," she said quietly, turning toward the door. "Thank you for your time." As she walked out into the rain, Eleanor pulled out her phone. She had some calls to make. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. Thomas had built this business on respect and dignity for all. Somewhere along the way, that message had been lost. She dialed her granddaughter's number, watching the rain create patterns on the dealership's windows. Things were about to change at Prestige Motors, and Eleanor Washington was going to make sure the lesson stuck. The rain had started falling harder now, but Eleanor didn't mind. She'd weathered far worse storms than this in building her empire. And sometimes, she thought, a storm was exactly what was needed to clear the air and start fresh. The drive home from Prestige Motors felt longer than usual. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel of her trusted old sedan, its familiar leather worn smooth from years of use. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, matching her thoughtful mood as she navigated through the city streets she'd known for over 5 decades. She couldn't help but smile at the irony. The very people who had dismissed her owned their jobs to decisions she'd made in boardrooms they'd never even seen. The Washington Automotive Group hadn't become an industry leader by accident. It had taken years of careful planning, smart investments, and most importantly, Thomas's unwavering belief that every person who walked through their doors deserved respect. As Eleanor turned onto the tree-lined street where she lived, memories flooded back. This neighborhood, once considered the wrong side of the tracks, had been home to their first tiny apartment. Now, the modest houses had become sought-after properties, though Eleanor had never seen a reason to move. Her 2-story brick home looked like any other on the block, neat, well-maintained, but nothing flashy. Inside was a different story. Eleanor hung her damp raincoat in the entryway, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors that Thomas had insisted on installing himself, even after they could afford to hire the best contractors in town. The living room walls showcased their life together, photos of business openings, charity events, and family celebrations. Their first dealership ribbon-cutting ceremony still held pride of place above the fireplace. She settled into her favorite armchair, the one Thomas used to tease her about never replacing even though they could buy 100 like it. The familiar scent of leather and the slight creak as she leaned back brought comfort after the morning's events. Reaching for her phone, Eleanor called the one person who would understand exactly how to handle this situation. "Grandma," her granddaughter's voice answered on the second ring. "Aren't you supposed to be car shopping today?" "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice warm despite the morning's events. "Oh, I tried. But it seems Prestige Motors isn't interested in serving everyone these days." There was a pause on the other end of the line. What happened? The sharp edge in her granddaughter's voice reminded Eleanor so much of Thomas, that same protective instinct, that same fire for justice. As Eleanor recounted the morning's events, she could practically hear her granddaughter pacing in her New York office. The prestigious consulting firm where she worked had taught her well about handling corporate crises, but this was personal. "That's our flagship dealership," her granddaughter exclaimed. "The one Dad always said was Grandpa's pride and joy. How dare they? We should fire everyone involved immediately." Eleanor chuckled softly. Now. Your grandfather would say that's a waste of a perfectly good teaching opportunity. Remember how he handled that manager back in '89 who was turning away young buyers? The one he sent to work at the used car lot for a month. Her granddaughter's tone softened with the memory. Grandpa said it was the best lesson that man ever learned about judging books by their covers. Exactly, Eleanor said, standing to walk over to the mahogany desk that still held some of Thomas's old files. "I think it's time we arranged a surprise visit from corporate. But first, we need to understand exactly what's been happening at Prestige Motors when no one thinks the owner is watching." For the next hour, grandmother and granddaughter planned. Eleanor pulled up the dealership's recent performance reports on her tablet, reports she normally left to her executives to handle. Her granddaughter accessed the customer complaint database, and a troubling pattern began to emerge. "Look at these reviews," her granddaughter said. "Multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment, all mysteriously resolved with no corporate follow-up. Someone's been burying these reports." Eleanor shook her head, thinking of Thomas and how he built their business on word-of-mouth recommendations and repeat customers. "Your grandfather used to say that a business is only as good as how it treats its most vulnerable customer." As they dug deeper, the story became clearer. Prestige Motors was still profitable, still moving luxury cars at an impressive rate, but it had lost its way. The inclusive, welcoming atmosphere that had been the foundation of Washington Automotive Group's success had been replaced by elitism and prejudice. "I think it's time we reminded them who they're really working for," Eleanor said, her voice firm with resolve. "But we're going to do this the right way. No dramatic scenes, no public humiliation. We're going to make this a lesson they'll never forget, but more importantly, one that will actually change things." Her granddaughter was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking, Grandma?" Elena smiled, looking at a photo of Thomas from the early days, standing proudly in front of their first dealership. "I'm thinking it's time for the owner of Washington Automotive Group to pay an official visit to Prestige Motors. But first, we need to gather evidence, build our case, and make sure this changes more than just one dealership. Your grandfather always said that real change has to come from the heart, not just from fear of getting caught." As they continued planning, the rain outside began to clear. Elena walked to the window, watching the sun break through the clouds. She thought about all the people who might have walked away from that dealership feeling the way she had today. People with dreams, with potential, with money to spend, who were judged before they could even speak. "We'll start tomorrow," she told her granddaughter. "I think it's time for a complete review of all our dealerships. Prestige Motors won't be the only one getting a wake-up call." As she hung up the phone, Elena felt a familiar determination settling over her. Thomas had always said she was at her most formidable when she was quiet. The staff at Prestige Motors had no idea what was coming, but by the time she was done, they'd never look at a customer the same way again. She picked up a framed photo from her desk, herself and Thomas at the opening of their 10th dealership. "Well, my love," she whispered to his smiling image, "looks like I've got some work to do. Time to remind them what Washington Automotive Group really stands for." The next morning arrived with a crisp brightness that made the previous day's rain feel like a distant memory. Elena sat at her kitchen table, sipping her morning tea from the china cup Thomas had given her on their 40th anniversary. Her granddaughter's laptop hummed quietly as they reviewed the data they'd gathered overnight. "These numbers don't add up, Grandma," her granddaughter said, pushing her glasses up her nose as she scrolled through spreadsheets. She'd flown in from New York on the first morning flight, arriving with the determination that Eleanor recognized from her own younger days. "Look at these customer satisfaction scores. They're reporting almost perfect numbers to corporate, but the independent surveys tell a different story." Eleanor leaned forward, studying the screen. Her years of experience in the business made the discrepancies clear as day. "They're cherry-picking their feedback," she said, shaking her head. "Only counting responses from certain types of customers. Your grandfather would have never stood for this." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm light on the pile of printed complaints they'd gathered. Eleanor picked up one particularly troubling report. A young doctor who'd been told to come back with her husband when trying to purchase a luxury SUV. The doctor had taken her business elsewhere, but not before writing a detailed account of her experience. "Look at this," her granddaughter said, turning the laptop screen. "Their hiring practices over the last 3 years. Notice anything?" Elena studied the employment records. The diversity that Thomas had always insisted on had slowly but surely been drained from the dealership's staff. The few remaining employees from different backgrounds were all in lower-level positions, never promoted despite excellent performance reviews. "They've been careful about it," Eleanor observed, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Just gradual enough to fly under corporate's radar. But the pattern is clear as day when you look at the whole picture." Her granddaughter pulled up another document. "And here's their community engagement report. Remember how Grandpa always insisted on being part of the neighborhood? Look at where they're focusing their outreach now." The map on the screen told its own story. All of Prestige Motors' community events and sponsorships were concentrated in the wealthiest parts of town. Abandoning the broader community involvement that had been a cornerstone of Washington Automotive Group's philosophy. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her neighborhood. From her kitchen, she could see Mrs. Thompson next door tending to her roses, the same Mrs. Thompson who'd babysat Eleanor's children when they were starting the business. This community had supported them when they were nothing but a young couple with big dreams. Thomas had never forgotten that. "We need more than just numbers," Eleanor said finally, turning back to her granddaughter. "I want to know what's happening on that showroom floor when nobody's watching." Her granddaughter smiled, pulling out her phone. "Already on it, Grandma. I hired a professional mystery shopping service last night. They're sending in customers of different backgrounds all week. We'll have video, audio, and detailed reports of how each one is treated. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Your grandfather always said the truth comes out in how you treat people when you think nobody's looking. She walked over to the family photos lining the hallway, stopping at one taken at the opening of Prestige Motors. Thomas stood proudly in front of the dealership, his arm around a young salesman he'd mentored, a kid from the neighborhood who'd gone on to own his own dealership. What they've forgotten, Eleanor continued, is that luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about making everyone feel special. She turned back to her granddaughter. We're not just going to catch them doing wrong. We're going to remind them how to do right. They spent the rest of the morning planning. Eleanor's granddaughter set up a secure email account to receive the mystery shopper reports. They scheduled meetings with trusted executives who'd known Thomas and shared his values. By lunch, they had a clear picture of not just what had gone wrong, but how to fix it. The corporate inspection is scheduled for next Tuesday, her granddaughter announced, checking her calendar. I've arranged for our most thorough audit team. They'll go through everything: sales records, hiring practices, customer complaints, security footage. Eleanor nodded, then walked to her closet. Inside, past her everyday clothes, hung a designer suit she bought for special occasions. I think it's time this came out, she said, running her hand along the fine fabric. Your grandfather always said presentation matters, especially when you're teaching someone a lesson about prejudging people. Her granddaughter looked up from her laptop. Are you sure you want to be there in person? We could handle this through official channels. Eleanor smiled, thinking of the dismissive looks she'd received at the dealership. I'll be there. Some lessons need a personal touch. She paused, looking at her reflection in the mirror. But first, I think I'll pay them another visit tomorrow. Same clothes, same attitude. Let's see if anything's changed. Why go through that again? Her granddaughter asked, concerned. Because, Eleanor said, her voice firm but gentle, sometimes you need to understand the pain to properly fix the problem. Your grandfather taught me that. He used to say that every complaint is an opportunity to make things right. She smiled at a memory. Remembered how he used to give his personal phone number to unhappy customers. Said it was the fastest way to learn what needed fixing. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Eleanor and her granddaughter finalized their plans. The corporate inspection would be thorough but fair. The goal wasn't to punish, but to transform, to bring Prestige Motors back to the principles it was founded on. One more thing, Eleanor said, picking up her phone. Call our old friend Mr. Chen at the Business Journal. I think it's time people knew who really owns Washington Automotive Group. Your grandfather always wanted me to step into the spotlight, said it would inspire people. Maybe he was right. Her granddaughter smiled, understanding perfectly. This wasn't just about one bad experience or one poorly managed dealership. It was about setting an example, about showing that success and integrity could go hand in hand. Ready for tomorrow? Her granddaughter asked as they wrapped up their planning. Eleanor looked at Thomas's picture one more time. More than ready, she said softly. It's time to wake some people up. The next morning, Eleanor stood in front of her mirror, carefully recreating her appearance from the previous day. The same simple raincoat, though the weather was clear. The same comfortable shoes. The same modest handbag. Her granddaughter watched from the doorway, concern evident in her eyes. You don't have to do this, Grandma, she said softly. We already have enough evidence. Eleanor adjusted her collar, a determined glint in her eye. Some things you need to see for yourself, dear. Your grandfather taught me that. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I want to give them one more chance to do the right thing. They had spent the previous evening reviewing the first batch of mystery shopper reports. The results were disheartening but not surprising. Wealthy-looking customers were treated like royalty, while others were supply, or not so supply, discouraged from shopping there. The pattern was clear, consistent, and completely against everything Washington Automotive Group stood for. Elena drove to the dealership in her trusted old car, her granddaughter following discreetly in a rental. The morning sun made the dealership's glass walls gleam like a jewel box. Inside, the same expensive cars sat in perfect formation, waiting for the right buyers, or at least what the staff considered the right buyers. This time, Elena noticed something she'd missed before. A young couple was leaving just as she arrived, their faces tight with barely contained frustration. The woman was clutching her partner's arm, whispering something that made him shake his head. Elena recognized that look. It was the same one she'd worn yesterday. Inside, the atmosphere was exactly as she remembered. The same dismissive glances, the same studied indifference from the sales staff. Elena walked straight to the black sedan she'd inquired about yesterday, running her hand along its sleek hood. "Ma'am," a voice called out sharply, "please don't touch the merchandise." Elena turned to find a different sales manager approaching, a woman this time, wearing designer clothes and an artificial smile. The manager's heels clicked purposefully across the showroom floor. "I believe you were here yesterday," the manager said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a welcome return visit. "As my colleague explained, our vehicles might not be the best fit for your situation." Elena met her gaze steadily. "And what situation would that be?" The manager's smile tightened. "We cater to a very specific clientele here at Prestige Motors. Perhaps I can recommend several other dealerships that might be more appropriate." From her position near the window, Elena could see her granddaughter in the parking lot, recording everything on her phone. But more importantly, she could see another couple being welcomed with open arms. The difference in treatment couldn't have been more obvious. "I'd like to speak to your general manager," Elena said calmly. "I'm afraid he's in a meeting," the manager replied quickly, too quickly. "And quite frankly, ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to leave. We can't have you disturbing our serious customers." Just then, Eleanor's phone buzzed. A text from her granddaughter. "Mystery shoppers reporting same treatment at 3 other locations. It's systematic." Eleanor took a deep breath, thinking of Thomas. He'd always said that the hardest part of running a business wasn't making money, it was maintaining your values while you did it. Looking around the showroom, she could see how far this place had strayed from those values. "Very well," Eleanor said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby customers. "I'll leave. But I want you to remember something. 30 years ago, I walked into a dealership just like this. The salesman took one look at me and my husband and decided we weren't worth their time." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That dealership went out of business 2 years later. We bought the building and turned it into our first luxury car showroom." The manager's confident smile faltered slightly. "Is that supposed to be some kind of threat?" Elena shook her head. "No, dear. It's supposed to be a lesson. One that this dealership seems to have forgotten." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and when your general manager is done with his fictional meeting, you might want to tell him to check his emails. I believe there's going to be a corporate inspection next week." As she walked out into the sunlight, Elena heard the buzz of conversation behind her. Her granddaughter was waiting by the car, trying to hide a proud smile. "Got it all on video," her granddaughter said quietly. "Plus 3 different mystery shoppers documented similar experiences just this morning. The pattern is undeniable." Eleanor nodded, looking back at the dealership. Through the glass walls, she could see the manager hurrying toward the back offices, a confident strut replaced by something more urgent. "You know what the sad part is?" Elena said as they walked to their cars. "That sedan they wouldn't even let me test drive. We sold the exact same model to a young entrepreneur last month at our downtown location. He didn't have fancy clothes or a flashy car. But our sales team there saw his potential, just like Thomas would have. He ended up buying 2 vehicles for his company." Her granddaughter checked her phone again. "Corporate inspection team is all set for next week. We've got mystery shoppers scheduled for every day until then. The evidence is piling up." Elena started her car, thinking about all the customers who'd been turned away, all the sales lost, all the relationships damaged. It wasn't just about the money, it never had been. It was about respect, about opportunity, about seeing the potential in people regardless of how they looked or what they wore. "Next week," she said firmly, "we're going to remind them what Washington Automotive Group really stands for. Your grandfather built this company on respect and opportunity for everyone. It's time to bring that back." As they drove away, Eleanor caught one last glimpse of the dealership in her rearview mirror. By this time next week, everything would change. Not just for Prestige Motors, but for every dealership in their group. Thomas had always said that real change had to start at the top. Well, it didn't get any higher than the owner herself. The morning of the corporate inspection dawned clear and bright. Elena stood in her walk-in closet, this time reaching past her simple clothes to the back, where a perfectly tailored navy blue suit hung waiting. As she dressed, she could hear her granddaughter in the kitchen, coordinating with the inspection team over the phone. It's like getting ready for battle, Eleanor mused to herself, pinning on the small golden pin Thomas had given her when they opened their 10th dealership. But this is a battle for the soul of our company. The corporate inspection team arrived at Prestige Motors precisely at 9 a.m. Four serious-looking executives in crisp suits, armed with tablets and folders full of data. Elena and her granddaughter waited in a coffee shop across the street, watching the scene unfold through the dealership's glass walls. The general manager's actually there today, her granddaughter noted, checking her phone. First time all week. Funny how an email about a corporate visit can cure a week-long meeting schedule. Elena sipped her tea, watching the staff scramble to accommodate the inspection team. Through the windows, she could see them pulling out files, showing off their pristine showroom, putting on their best corporate smiles. The same staff who had dismissed her twice were now the picture of professional courtesy. Time to gather everyone, Eleanor said, checking her watch. Her granddaughter nodded and sent a quick text. Within minutes, the general manager was calling all staff to the main showroom floor for what he thought would be a standard corporate presentation. Elena stood, smoothing her suit. Ready? Her granddaughter gathered their materials, a week's worth of mystery shopper reports, customer complaints, hiring records, and security footage. Ready, Grandma. Let's go remind them what this company stands for. They crossed the street together, Eleanor's comfortable but elegant heels clicking on the pavement. This time, when she pushed open the dealership's glass doors, the effect was dramatically different. The security guard who had watched her suspiciously on previous visits rushed to hold the door. The receptionist stood up straight, trying to hide his surprise at seeing the woman he'd dismissed now dressed like an executive. The showroom was packed with staff, all facing the corporate team at the front. The general manager was mid-speech about their commitment to excellence when Eleanor and her granddaughter walked in through the side entrance. One of the corporate executives spotted them and immediately stepped aside, gesturing for Eleanor to take the center position. The general manager faltered mid-sentence. I'm sorry, but this is a private corporate meeting. Oh, I'm well aware, Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the showroom. In fact, I called it. She walked to the front, her granddaughter beside her, watching recognition slowly dawn on some faces in the crowd. Allow me to introduce myself properly, Eleanor continued, turning to face the assembled staff. I'm Eleanor Washington, owner and chairwoman of Washington Automotive Group. Some of you may remember me from my visits last week, though the welcome was somewhat different. The silence in the showroom was absolute. The sales manager who had dismissed her just days ago had gone pale. The general manager's mouth opened and closed without making a sound. Now, we could spend the next hour going through all the evidence we've gathered, Eleanor said, gesturing to the files her granddaughter held. The discriminatory practices, the buried customer complaints, the biased hiring patterns. We have quite a thorough documentation, thanks to our mystery shoppers and your own security cameras. She paused, looking around the room. Some faces showed fear, others shame. A few showed genuine surprise. Clearly not everyone had been aware of the systematic discrimination taking place. But that's not why I'm here, Eleanor continued, her voice softening slightly. I'm here because somewhere along the way, this dealership, and perhaps others in our group, have forgotten what Washington Automotive Group stands for. She walked over to a photo on the wall, one she knew Thomas had insisted be displayed in every dealership they owned. It showed their first location, a humble used car lot with a hand-painted sign. My husband Thomas started this company with a simple belief that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing. He knew that you can't judge a person's worth by their appearance because he'd been judged that way himself. We both had. Eleanor turned back to the crowd, noting how some of the younger staff members were listening intently, perhaps hearing this history for the first time. Last week, I walked in here dressed simply, looking to buy our top-of-the-line sedan. I was ignored, dismissed, and finally asked to leave. The next day, I came back, hoping things would be different. They weren't. But do you know what happened at our downtown location that same day? She pulled out her tablet, bringing up a sales report. A young woman in ripped jeans and a t-shirt walked in. The sales team there treated her with respect, took the time to understand her needs. Turns out she was buying fleet vehicles for her tech startup. 6 cars, paid in full. The general manager seemed to shrink with each word. Elena could see him mentally calculating the commission his team had lost through their prejudice. But this isn't about lost sales, Elena said firmly. It's about lost values. It's about forgetting that luxury isn't about excluding people, it's about making everyone feel special. About seeing the potential in every person who walks through those doors. Her granddaughter stepped forward, distributing folders to key staff members. Inside, you'll find our new corporate guidelines. Mandatory diversity training, updated hiring practices, mystery shopper programs, and a direct customer feedback line that reports straight to corporate and to me personally. Elena watched as they flipped through the documents, realization dawning that this wasn't just a reprimand, it was a complete overhaul. Changes start today, she announced. Some of you will be reassigned. Others will need to decide if you can embrace our company's true values. But all of you will learn what Washington Automotive Group has always stood for: opportunity, respect, and service for all. She paused, looking at the faces before her. Any questions? The silence stretched for a moment before a young salesman in the back raised his hand. Mrs. Washington, that sedan you were interested in, is it still available? Elena smiled, thinking of Thomas and how he would have appreciated that moment of lightness. Actually, it is. Why don't you show it to me? Let's see if you remember how to treat a customer properly this time. As the nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, Elena could feel the atmosphere shifting. This wasn't just about correcting bad behavior, it was about rekindling the spirit that had made Washington Automotive Group special in the first place. The real work would begin tomorrow, but for now, Elena had made her point. Thomas would have been proud. The weeks following Eleanor's revelation at Prestige Motors brought waves of change throughout Washington Automotive Group. The morning sun streamed through the dealership's windows, catching on the newly installed customer service pledge displayed prominently near the entrance, words that Thomas had lived by, now renewed for a new generation. Elena sat in what had once been the general manager's office, reviewing the latest progress reports with her granddaughter. The old manager had been reassigned to their training facility, where he would spend 6 months learning the fundamentals of inclusive customer service alongside new recruits. Look at these numbers, her granddaughter said, spreading out the latest sales figures. Customer satisfaction up 40% in just 3 weeks. Sales have actually increased, not dropped like some people feared. Elena nodded, remembering Thomas's words. Treat everyone like they could be your best customer, and many of them will be. The showroom floor had been transformed, not just in policy but in spirit. The staff now included people of all backgrounds, each chosen for their ability to connect with customers and their commitment to service. The young salesman who had asked about the sedan that pivotal day had been promoted to floor supervisor, his natural empathy making him perfect for the role. Mrs. Washington. A gentle knock at the door interrupted their review. The new customer service manager, a woman who had started as a receptionist at one of their other locations 15 years ago, stood in the doorway. I think you'll want to see this. They followed her to the showroom floor, where a scene was unfolding that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. An elderly gentleman in work clothes was being shown their top-of-the-line vehicles by 2 enthusiastic salespeople. His hands were calloused from years of construction work, his boots leaving slight marks on the pristine floor, but no one seemed to mind. He's buying 3 trucks for his construction company, the customer service manager explained quietly, plus a luxury sedan for his wife's retirement gift. Would have been turned away a month ago. Elena watched as the man signed the paperwork, his face beaming with pride. The sales team had arranged financing options that worked for his business, treated him with respect, and earned not just a sale but a lifetime customer. Later that afternoon, Elena stood in the break room, watching the staff during their training session. The walls, once bare except for sales targets, now displayed photos of community events, customer success stories, and the history of Washington Automotive Group, including a prominent picture of Thomas standing in front of their first lot. Today's topic is looking past first impressions, the trainer announced. Elena recognized her. She'd been one of the mystery shoppers during their investigation, and her feedback had been so insightful that they'd hired her to help reshape their training program. As Eleanor listened, she heard the staff sharing stories of assumptions proved wrong, of surprising sales, of connections made with customers they might have overlooked before. The change wasn't just in policies, it was in hearts and minds. Remember last week? One salesperson said to another during a break, "That young woman in the paint-stained clothes? Turned out she owns 3 art galleries, bought 2 cars right there." His colleague nodded. "I had a similar experience. Guy came in wearing gym clothes, looking like he just finished a workout. He ended up buying our most expensive model for his company's CEO. He was the head of purchasing for a major corporation." Eleanor smiled, remembering similar stories Thomas used to tell. He'd always said that the best salespeople were the ones who could see the person behind the appearance. Her granddaughter approached with another stack of reports. "The changes are spreading to other dealerships," she said excitedly. "Our downtown location has already adopted the new training program. 3 more have requested it." But it wasn't just the training that was making a difference. Eleanor had insisted on structural changes too. Every dealership now had a direct customer feedback line that reported to corporate. Mystery shoppers regularly tested the staff's commitment to fair treatment. Hiring practices had been overhauled to focus on character and customer service skills rather than just sales numbers. The most significant change, though, was in the atmosphere. Gone was the cold, exclusive feel that had crept in over the years. In its place was something warmer, more welcoming, more like the environment Thomas had created in their very first location. "Mrs. Washington." A young salesperson approached hesitantly. "Could I ask you something?" Eleanor nodded encouragingly. The young woman had been one of the quieter staff members during the changes, but Eleanor had noticed her careful attention to the new policies. "I have this idea," she continued, gaining confidence. "What if we started a mentorship program, connecting experienced salespeople with new hires from different backgrounds? I think it could help us build an even more inclusive team." Eleanor felt her heart warm. This was exactly the kind of thinking Thomas had always encouraged, employees taking initiative to make things better. "Write up a proposal," Eleanor said warmly. "We'll review it next week. And thank you, that's exactly the kind of innovation we need." As the afternoon wound down, Eleanor took one last walk through the showroom. A diverse mix of customers browsed the vehicles, each receiving the same attentive service. The sound of genuine laughter and comfortable conversation filled the space. Near the entrance, she paused by the customer service pledge. Below it hung a new edition, a simple quote from Thomas that she had found in his old papers. "Every person who walks through these doors carries dreams. Our job is to help make them reality." Her granddaughter joined her, holding the latest customer satisfaction surveys. "Look at this comment," she said, pointing to one response. "For the first time, I felt like I belonged in a luxury dealership. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just a wallet." Eleanor touched the golden pin on her lapel. Thomas's gift from so many years ago. "That's what it was always supposed to be about," she said softly. "Not just selling cars, but giving people dignity, respect, and the chance to make their dreams come true." As they prepared to leave for the day, Eleanor saw a familiar face enter the dealership, the woman who had been turned away with her partner the day of her second visit. This time, they were greeted immediately, warmly, professionally. Some lessons, Eleanor thought, watching the positive interaction unfold, change more than just one business. They changed the world, one person at a time. 6 months had passed since the day Eleanor Washington revealed her identity at Prestige Motors. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the dealership's parking lot as she pulled up in her new black sedan, the same model she'd been dismissed for asking about half a year ago. Today was special. The dealership was hosting its first Community Appreciation Day, an idea that had grown from the staff themselves. The showroom had been transformed into a gathering space with local food vendors, live music, and most importantly, an atmosphere that welcomed everyone. Eleanor walked through the crowd, smiling at the mix of people filling the space. Children played around the display vehicles while their parents chatted with sales staff about their dreams of ownership. The barriers of intimidation that had once surrounded luxury car buying were dissolving before her eyes. "Grandma." Her granddaughter waved from near the customer service desk, where she was helping coordinate the day's events. "You need to see this." She led Eleanor to a wall that had once displayed only sales awards. Now it held something new, a collection of framed letters from customers, each telling a story of how Washington Automotive Group had helped make their dreams come true. This one came in yesterday, her granddaughter said, pointing to the newest edition. The letter was from a young teacher who had been saving for years to buy her first luxury car. She wrote about how the staff had worked with her to find the perfect vehicle within her budget, treating her with the same respect as customers buying the most expensive models. "Mrs. Washington," a voice called from behind them. Elena turned to find the young salesperson who had proposed the mentorship program. "Remember that idea we discussed 6 months ago? I'd like you to meet some people." She led Eleanor to a group of new employees, each paired with an experienced staff member. The program had expanded beyond the dealership, creating opportunities for people who might never have considered a career in luxury car sales before. "We've hired 15 new team members through the program," the young woman explained proudly, "and our customer satisfaction scores are the highest they've ever been." Elena watched as one of the mentor pairs worked with a customer, a small business owner in paint-stained work clothes. The interaction was natural, respectful, focused on understanding needs rather than making assumptions. Near the refreshment table, Elena overheard 2 longtime employees talking to a group of new hires. "You should have seen this place before," one was saying. "We thought being exclusive meant excluding people. Mrs. Washington taught us that true luxury is about making everyone feel special." The other nodded. "Remember that first week after the changes? I was so worried about our sales numbers. Now I can't imagine doing business any other way. Turns out, treating people right is actually good for business." Elena's granddaughter joined her again, tablet in hand. "The numbers came in from corporate," she said excitedly. "Every dealership that's implemented our new policies has seen increases in both sales and customer satisfaction. 3 other auto groups have contacted us about licensing our training program." But it wasn't the numbers that made Eleanor proudest. It was moments like watching a young family being treated with dignity as they explored their options for their first luxury vehicle, or seeing the genuine smiles on the faces of staff members as they connected with customers from all walks of life. Later in the afternoon, Eleanor found herself back in the office that had once belonged to the former general manager. The walls now held photos of community events, staff celebrations, and customer success stories. But her favorite addition was the small plaque on the desk, a quote from Thomas that had become the company's new motto: "Success isn't measured by what we gain, but by how many dreams we help achieve." A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the security guard who had watched her suspiciously on her first visit, now the head of their new customer welcome team. "Mrs. Washington, there's someone here I think you should meet." He led her to the showroom where an elderly couple stood admiring the same model sedan that had started it all. The woman was wearing clothes very similar to what Eleanor had worn on that fateful day. "Welcome to Washington Automotive Group," Eleanor said warmly, approaching them. "How can we help make your dreams come true today?" The woman smiled, slightly surprised by the owner's personal greeting. "Actually, we've been saving for years," she said. "Our old car finally gave out, and our grandson suggested we come here. He said this was the one place that would treat us right." Elena spent the next hour with them, not selling, just listening to their stories, understanding their needs, and sharing some of her own journey. By the end of the day, they had not only bought their dream car, but had become part of the Washington Automotive Group family. As the community day wound down, Eleanor gathered the staff for a final word. The showroom glowed in the setting sun, the space filled with the warmth of shared purpose and pride. "Look around," she said, gesturing to the walls now covered with customer stories, community photos, and Thomas's words of wisdom. "This is what success looks like. Not just in sales figures, but in lives touched, in dreams made real, in barriers broken down." She paused, touching the golden pin on her lapel. "My husband used to say that a business is only as good as the hopes it helps build. Today, I saw those hopes in every corner of the showroom. You've not only changed how we sell cars, you've changed how people feel about themselves when they walk through those doors." As the staff began to clean up from the day's events, Eleanor took one last walk through the showroom. A young girl was sitting in the driver's seat of a display model, her parents watching proudly as she pretended to drive. The saleswoman helping them wasn't talking about prices or features. She was asking the girl about her dreams. Elena smiled, thinking of Thomas. "We did it," she whispered. "We brought it back to what it was always meant to be." Outside, the sun was setting on another day at Prestige Motors, but the light inside, the light of dignity, respect, and dreams made possible, would keep shining long into the future.